Good evening and welcome to The World Today. I'm sitting in London at the Bolivar Hall, and I'm going to be speaking with Andrew Murray, former chairman of Stop the War Committee, one of the only existing permanent anti-war campaigns in the world. Andrew is also chief of staff to the largest trade union in the country, to its leader Len McCluskey, and during this striking and remarkable election campaign that we've just concluded in Britain, he was a political advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, working together with Seamus Milne, the Director of Communications, to keep the campaign on the road and discipline. What has happened in Britain is the equivalent of a political earthquake, but it's the equivalent of a political earthquake only if you believe the mainstream press. The reports we were getting from different parts of the country was that Corbyn was popular, that the Labour Party manifesto was responsible largely for creating the new surge, coupled with Corbyn's own popularity as an individual and as a politician, and that Labour was going to do much, much better than the mainstream press and its opinion poll subsidiaries were saying. And that is how it turned out. That the vote gained by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is the third highest vote that Labour has achieved since 1945. It is the equivalent of one of Blair's votes and higher than two other election campaigns in which Blair won a majority of the country, but a vote much smaller than what Jeremy Corbyn has achieved. The other point, which will be familiar to many South American viewers, is that despite the consistent, heated, vicious, lying, slanderous attacks on Corbyn from the press and the media in general, he managed to come close to a surprising victory. And this is something that people often overestimate, is the power of the mainstream media. This power, as South America showed in election after election in the Bolivarian republics, can be challenged by mass movements, by social movements from below. So here we are with the Conservative government without a majority, forced to align with extremely reactionary terrorist currents in the north of Ireland, and Corbyn now patiently waiting, together with many of us, for the next election, which we hope that Labour will win. It will be a transformative election when it happens. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How was it like? Just describe the campaign itself. You were at the heart of it. You were talking to Jeremy most days. You were discussing things with him. What did it feel like?
Well, it was obviously a struggle. When the campaign began, Labour was, in the opinion polls you mentioned, polling at 25 to 27%. That was probably not wholly inaccurate at the time. We had local elections at the start of May where Labour didn't do particularly well, and everyone was thinking we were looking at impending electoral disaster. But over the last month, we gained steadily in the polls, an atmosphere of increasing, I suppose, excitement in the campaign. Now, I'd never been involved centrally in a general election campaign before. It's very frenetic. There's lots of small frictions and difficulties that pop up on a daily basis. But when you could see the huge reaction Jeremy Corbyn was getting as he went around the country at events that were largely unreported on the broadcast, let alone the print media, you had a sense of a mood really changing in the country. And of course, the best polls by the end of it were putting us at 39–40%, and even that slightly underestimated the final results. So it felt like a real battle, but increasingly with more and more wind in our sails, as the indicators were that the message was cutting through.
And Corbyn himself, of course, denounced, reviled, made fun of by the press as a weak person, someone who didn't have what it took to be Prime Minister, not just by the Tory press and their supporters, but within his own party by the hardcore Blairite right, who summoned a parliamentary meeting some months ago, humiliated him, attacked him, hoping to demoralize him and drive him out. That failed. And this says something about him, Andrew.
Well, he's a very resilient man. He's very committed to his principles. He's very comfortable in his own skin, very happy explaining and defending his views. I think all that came through in the campaign. The attacks on him, you would have to go back to, in Britain, to the attacks on Tony Benn in the 1970s, Arthur Scargill in the 1980s, to see such a similar level of vitriol, but it did not work. And I think one of the happy outcomes of this election is that progressive politicians in Britain need not be afraid of the Sun and the Daily Mail, the leading conservative tabloids, one of them owned by Rupert Murdoch, who needs little introduction, that they have thrown their worst at Jeremy Corbyn. They've abused him. They described him as, on the one hand, a pacifist, the other hand, a terrorist sympathiser, as if the two were somehow compatible. And it didn't work. There's a generation of young people in particular who voted overwhelmingly, we believe, we haven't seen the final statistics for Labour, on a record turnout for young people for whom these smears simply do not work. That's partly because there are other means of communicating now through social media that largely bypass these dinosaurs of the print media, but also because they just don't take it seriously. They know they've been treated with contempt by those papers. So yes, I mean, Jeremy himself is a very resilient, committed socialist, and the attacks on him really fell flat. And this must be worrying the establishment now, because it looks like there might be another general election before very long. As you mentioned, there's an unstable parliamentary situation. What more can they throw at Jeremy Corbyn? They must be worried about that.
One thing that has often happened in the past, that when politicians, especially Labour politicians, or even progressive politicians, have been attacked by the media, with the exceptions of Benn and, of course, Scargill, who wasn't strictly speaking a politician, but a union leader. But many capitulate to the media. I mean, when the Sun boasted, for instance, that they were responsible for defeating Neil Kinnock, he accepted that. And his successors, Blair and Brown, accepted that. I mean, Murdoch and his editors were in and out of Downing Street. And in that sense, the whole campaign which Labour has waged under Corbyn marks a big break with that, Andrew. And I think the effect of this, as you say, is going to be very positive, not just for young people, but for old people as well, make them less frightened of the media and more capable of coming out. But now, let's turn to the manifesto. Because this was, attacked, of course, but it was also underestimated by some on the Labour side. They thought manifestos don't matter. Well, this particular manifesto did matter. I mean, on three key issues: public transport, taking the railways back into public ownership; higher education, cancelling student debt, promising students that they will no longer have to pay tuition fees; and stopping the stealth privatization of the National Health Service. These were three key issues. And you saw people actually discussing the manifesto. I mean, I heard kids discussing it, thinking, is it true he's going to make higher education free, etc. Now, some Guardian columnists referred to this as sort of bribery, but I mean, these are sort of matters of principle for any respected social democratic leader, doesn't even have to be that left-wing.
I mean, who would describe free education as bribery?
I know.
It shows that the sort of cynicism of the neoliberal political culture that has evolved. But you're right. I mean, I think there were two stars of the Labour campaign. One was Jeremy Corbyn, the second was the manifesto. And you'd have to go back, I don't know when, to actually last find a general election in Britain where the manifestos of any parties were of any consequence at all. They were only read by civil servants and policy wonks, and the conventional wisdom was manifestos don't matter, it's all to do with the presentation of the leader and how effectively you smear your opponents or what have you. And this was absolutely different. As soon as the manifesto came out, you could see Labour's poll ratings starting to tick upwards. I mean, you've mentioned some of the main issues. There was also the promise to build 1 million new homes, which is a huge issue, particularly in London, where housing is really priced out for very many young people. Introduce a living wage of £10 an hour, and put a lot more money into the National Health Service, which is creaking under a sort of semi-privatisation, semi-starvation of funding policies. And all of these did really cut through. And I think one consequence of this election is it marks the breakdown of the neoliberal consensus, what you described in one of your books recently as the extreme centre, that domination. In a way, I think 2017 saw politics catching up with 2008. The crash, the economic crash, which really meant that the neoliberals of the left and the right had nothing much left to offer. Often there's a lag between big economic events and politics catching up. I think that is what we can see happening now. And you had a manifesto that perhaps older people would have remembered the day when the Labour Party had manifestos a bit like that. You wouldn't have seen it for 30 years or more, possibly. And it really did make a difference because young people could see there was an alternative. I mean, I wouldn't say in past elections there's been no difference, but it's been pretty much in the margins in many cases. This time they could see there's a real difference, and these weren't wild promises. They were going to be met by taxing the top 5% of income earners and corporations a bit more money, and also by investing in growth, which of course generates more tax revenues as well. So it was a costed programme of radical social reform.
Andrew, the other question is, of course, the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, people coming from abroad used to be shocked at the vitriol which a right-wing Labour MP would pour on Corbyn's head, you know, basically denouncing him, leaking stuff to the press, trying to make his position worse. What will change after this election?
Well, you're right, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the majority of it opposed Jeremy Corbyn from the beginning. A year ago, they attempted to remove him. He was only elected as leader 2 years ago, as you know, and that was overwhelmingly defeated by the votes of Labour Party members. But they've maintained this drumbeat of criticism and abuse on occasion. But the premise of this was Jeremy Corbyn's a loser. Jeremy Corbyn's
he was unelectable.
Unelectable. Now he has got an increase in the vote from 2015. Just 2 years ago, Labour got just over 30% of the vote under Ed Miliband, up to over 40%. That is really almost unprecedented as an increase in British politics. He fell just short of the level required to form a government now, but it's way beyond anything his critics inside or outside the party had anticipated as possible. Now, since the election, most of those who have commented have said, well, we got it wrong. They said that with some differing degrees of force, but they have said it. The fact is, Jeremy Corbyn's standing in the Labour Party and the country is now, I think, so high that his critics will have to take note of that. And they all fought on the same manifesto. They all stood on that manifesto. They'll all be aware of how popular it was, how it reached people who've not voted Labour before or not voted at all before. They will have to take account of that. They'll also have to take account of the fact that another general election in the not too distant future seems a likelihood, as this sort of spatchcocked coalition of the Tories and the sectarian Democratic Unionists doesn't exude stability, to say the least. And so that will be a further pressure on them to unite behind their leader. So we can only hope that the bitter divisions of the last year or so, without which Labour might have done better still, will now be behind us.
And what part do you think did momentum, the organisation created after this massive influx of support for Corbyn, people joining the Labour Party, up to 500,000 people, their most politically capable entrants participating in Momentum. What do you feel what was the role of this particular organisation?
I think in the election campaign it was wholly positive. Momentum was set up under the circumstances you've described a couple of years ago. It's had a bit of an uneven path since, some problems that will be familiar to those of us on the left down the years. But in the campaign it really did mobilise an awful lot of the younger people in the Labour Party. It produced some very hard-hitting, powerful videos attacking the Tories and sort of complemented in some ways sharper than the Labour Party's official campaign work. So I think Momentum now has a very strong future. And one of the issues which had troubled it was its focus inside the Labour Party, or building a sort of broader, different sort of organisation. Perhaps a bit of a false polarity there. Yeah. But now it has really shown its worth, and that it supplements, but not in any way replace or undermine the work of the Labour Party officially, as it were.
Let's turn now to the Conservative government, which has emerged from this election. It's been badly wounded. It's extremely weak. The pro-EU wing of the party is on the warpath. Theresa May has sacked her two close advisors, one of whom, Nick Timothy, was a Chamberlain Conservative coming up with ideas not too dissimilar to those of Ed Miliband, and insisting that a break of some sort with neoliberalism was necessary. These people have now been fired. She's just taken on Damian Green, a Europhile, as her de facto deputy prime minister, trying to keep the party together. At the same time, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, now editor of the Evening Standard, courtesy a Russian oligarch, has a headline referring to her as dead woman walking. So the tensions inside the Conservative Party, Andrew, must be very high at the moment.
Well, they are. I think on this occasion I would agree with George Osborne, at least on the fact that Theresa May, it's very hard to see her surviving for very long, because it has to be understood, she called this general election 3 years ahead of time. It was a general election of choice. She had a parliamentary majority before it that wasn't enormous, but was quite comfortable, 20 or so, probably more in practice. And she called this election in the expectation of a coronation. She'd been built up as sort of almost not a partisan politician, but the sort of mother of the nation who would lead us through Brexit in a way that sort of corresponded to their idea of the national interest. And it completely blew up in her face. It turned out she fought a dreadful campaign. You've mentioned the Labour Manifesto. The Conservative Manifesto was a disaster. They had several policies all aimed at making life harder for older people, who are the core Conservative constituency demographically. That led to undoubted fall in their support.
The dementia tax, which Labour called it, you know, one of the more inventive...
inventive phrases. The dementia tax, so people would have to pay for their own social care. I mean, basically what it meant was that if you were very ill with cancer, the NHS would look after you for nothing. If you were very ill with dementia, you'd have to fund your care yourself from the value of your house. They also attacked what's called the triple lock, which is a scheme that guarantees the value of pensioners' incomes. They said they'd remove that and take away the winter fuel allowance, which helps older people pay their heating bills in winter. So all of this was an attack on a core constituency. They had to start dropping some of these proposals or modifying them within days. It was a completely inept campaign. And it proved that, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, who thrives on his contact with ordinary people, Theresa May didn't. A very wooden campaigner, staged events. She avoided debating Jeremy Corbyn throughout the election. Every opportunity where they could both appear on a platform, have an argument about their policies, she ducked. So a dreadful campaign. And now here's the Conservative Party. This is for a party that prides itself as putting the national interest first. For party interest, they had a referendum on Europe to try and gain party advantage. That led to the downfall of David Cameron, and now Theresa May. But you are, I think, right to draw attention to this interesting fact of Nick Timothy, her advisor, who is actually leading the Conservative Party, and presumably speaking for Theresa May, away from neoliberalism towards something that addressed more a broader constituency, which is why she thought she could cut through to northern working class voters. He's now been ousted. Theresa May had some critics within big business and of course within the Tory party for being insufficiently pro-business. One can only assume that those elements will now try and counter-attack and bring Theresa May more back to the sort of conservatism that has been the norm since Thatcher, really, the last 35, 40 years, of being free market neoliberals to the end. But that will not solve their problem, because that is what people voted against. Yeah. So there is no way forward for the Conservative Party in going back to pure Thatcherism.
I mean, it is quite staggering that constituencies like Canterbury, like Kensington in London, you know, which has been a byword for rich lifestyles, that this constituency, Labour, won by 30 or 40 votes. And that was astonishing. It just showed the sort of weight, if you like, of the surge. You know, people had had enough of the old regime, whether Labour or Tory, and wanted something different.
Well, they did, and I think the two examples you cite are both interesting in perhaps slightly different ways. Canterbury, I think it will be shown that it's a huge student vote, obviously attracted by, not just by the promise of an end to tuition fees, but the broader offer of an alternative, something to address their concerns, and their idealism, possibly. That, I think, was a huge factor in Canterbury. In Kensington, of course, Kensington is a very rich constituency. Most of its richest people, or many of them anyway, can't vote because they are oligarchs or from the Middle East and they're not on the electoral register. But there are large pockets of deprivation in the north of that area, and these are people who probably didn't bother voting before, in many cases, not all obviously, who felt that they were going to lose anyway, there's nothing to be gained, there wasn't enough of a difference to make them feel they wanted to get up and vote. Well, they did this time, and that is the most extraordinary result. It is, if not the richest, one of the richest constituencies in the country, and to win that was the sort of cherry on the cake.
I must point out that it's not just the young who went out to vote for Jeremy. The old, quite a number of elderly people did. I mean, a lady I happen to know, because she's the mother of an old radical friend of mine, is 106 years old. She's all there, no sign of dementia, but she's in her home, and my friend went and explained to her. He said, "Mum, it's Corbyn. She's been following the election campaign. Do you want to go and vote?" She's in Kensington. And she said, "Yes, I want to vote." So she went and voted for Jeremy. And the funny thing is that her husband was a newly elected Labour MP, her ex-husband, in 1945. And she remembers dancing with Clement Attlee at the Victory Ball in 1945. So we're now telling her to hang on in there, Andrew, that next year she could trip the Light Fantastic with Jeremy. We'll make sure that that happens.
I'm sure he'd be very happy to. I mean, you're absolutely right, of course. It's not a one-generational thing. That couldn't possibly be the case. And there are many older people, including some others who remember 1945, who think for the first time, if not since then, the first time in a long time, there's been a Labour leadership, a Labour manifesto, that has sort of rekindled some of the idealism of that time.
Let's discuss foreign policy for a minute, because, you know, it could be argued correctly that Jeremy's policies in the Manifesto on domestic issues were traditional social democratic policies. I mean, no one, even in Wilson's time, would have been particularly surprised by that. Wilson would have supported half of them, not to mention Attlee. Or even right-wing leaders like Gaitskell would have accepted quite a lot of that social democratic ideas in the manifesto. The one thing where Jeremy is very different, in my opinion, from any other political leader of the Labour Party is that he is not a NATO man. He is not in favour of an offensive foreign policy. He is against wasting money on nuclear weapons. He has opposed all the last wars of the American empire, and this was also one reason that they disliked him, that they couldn't control him. Now I know, he said it himself, his views haven't changed, he has to win the party round to these views. But this, I think, is what makes things very difficult for the British establishment. They don't like it. And there was that appalling incident where a serving General Chief of Army Staff said there'd be an army mutiny if Corbyn ever became Prime Minister, imagining the army was a unified force and there was no differences within it, etc. This is what made them nervous. Some are arguing that he's compromised too much on this.
Well, I think, first of all, you're correct. You can see a consensus could emerge in the Labour Party on domestic policy. As I said earlier, everyone fought on the same manifesto. There's not much opposition, I would say, to that now. It is within a mainstream, but a mainstream that was sort of broken 30 years ago by the embrace of neoliberalism, not only in Britain, but by socialist, social democratic parties more generally. And he sort of revived that tradition, and I think could get a very broad consensus in the Labour movement around it. His foreign policy has been challenged more. I would say there are two things where it's been an advantage to him. The most important is that he has been right about the wars of this century. Above all, Iraq. I mean, he was, alongside me, centrally involved in the Stop the War coalition from the beginning, played a very big part in campaigning against that. But also he was right. For example, he was one of very few MPs, I think it was no more than 13, who voted against the intervention in Libya by David Cameron and Sarkozy in 2011. And few people would say that has gone well now. So his consistent stand against war, reflecting his anti-imperialist views, I think have won him a lot of credibility with younger people in particular, but a broader audience, because I think he would probably not have been elected leader of the Labour Party in 2015 to begin with, had it not been in part for his lifelong campaigning against war. Also, I'd highlight his solidarity with the Palestinian people. This has, of course, led to some tremendous attacks upon him, but it's a popular cause in Britain today. So the fact that his foreign policy positions are more controversial, both in the Labour Party and outside it, I don't think works against him. People can see there is a connection between these things, and that the Iraq war, above all, and the whole war on terror, which has now been going on for 16 years or so, has been a calamity and completely failed. I think all that is to his credit. Now, you say, has he compromised too much? He has to take his party with him. He said when he's being interviewed on television by Jeremy Paxman, he's a leader of a democratic party. On some of the issues you've raised, NATO and Trident, the party has to take a position, and he has to represent that. He can have the argument inside the party, of course, but I don't think there's any shame in representing the policy of your party, even if you don't agree with us on every particular.
Two other questions on this, Andrew. One is the sort of utter absurdity with which the question of would he push the nuclear button if it was necessary. I mean, the fact that this has really never been raised in any other election campaign. Jeremy's reply was good. He said, well, look, by the time it's necessary for us to push it, it might all be over anyway, the world we live in, which is correct. But more importantly, I'm just a bit surprised that people forget the fact that no British politician, none, Prime Minister or whatever, has the authority to use nuclear weapons without the say-so of the Pentagon and the United States. This is not a decision a British politician can make, full stop. They should just say it, come out and say it.
Well, of course, it's true, the independent nuclear deterrent
is not independent.
It's not independent.
Yeah.
And this whole issue simply becomes a stick to beat Jeremy Corbyn with. No one's ever been asked that question in the past, really. Prime ministers or aspirant prime ministers haven't been asked it. I mean, the fact is, it is impossible to envisage any situation that might ever face Britain that could not be made worse by escalating to nuclear war. We're in a different position than, hypothetically, the USA or Russia might be under those circumstances. So really, again, it's an argument clearly that didn't get any real cut through. It was a desperate attempt to make Jeremy Corbyn look weak on defence. When people look at the world and they can see that is not the problem we're facing. The problems of the disintegration of one state after another in the Middle East, often as a result of intervention from the West, the huge refugee crisis that is creating, the terrorist problem that is contributing to.